Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. I've got Troy Johnson here, and he is the founder and partner of the Resource Development Group, LLC. And we were just having a very interesting conversation about rocks, and we're going to get much deeper into rocks. So, how did mining begin? Where did it all start? I mean, it's such an old thing, right? It's from the Bronze Age. Is that where mining started?
Probably even before that, because one of the first materials ever mined was salt. And uh, Probably pre-Bronze Age, there was a knowledge of how animals, there was a lot of observation of animals by humans. And to this day, you will see animals naturally gravitate towards sources of natural salt. And Eventually that became a staple, not only for I guess initially it was for the flavor that it added to food, but also I think there was eventually they realized that it was a healthy thing for them to have, and kind of went from there. And then I
Mm.
guess I'm surmising quite a bit, but I would assume that if they learned that about salt, then there would be associations with other things like
Oh,
the first cave drawings. They had to have ochre and other things. Kind of an interesting side note, my senior project in college, right? I have a bachelor's degree in science and geology, was the genesis of items called Indian paint pots. And essentially there, and I have some on my shelf that I showed you earlier. They were hollow iron concretions, but inside each one of these concretions in the hollow area is a pigment. It's a very, very fine colored pigment of, it ranges from purple to orange to red to yellow. And in the US, and these occur in the sand ridges of the southeastern US, and in that area, they would take that color and they would mix it with animal fat. And that would be how they would paint their face, they would paint their horses. And it's a pure pigment. I mean, it's very, very fine, and it's essentially the consistency of like a powdered makeup. And
huh.
well, anyway, my senior project was to posit a way that these form in sand ridges and that kind of thing. But I would imagine at some point someone broke one of those open and found this, and who knows how long ago that was, and realized that it was something unique and used it for wall painting or again painting themselves, etc.
Was that was that
Silver.
was that all over the world that it's the same thing, or was it only in the
I
southeast?
would I would think that I believe that this is relatively unique because it only forms in this type of sand ridge environment. But you can find obviously different colored clays and that kind of thing um, all over the world. And how it ties into mining is that I think eventually they would realize that these desired colors and consistencies of clay only occur in certain areas or in certain types of areas. And so I think, it technically it is mining. I think it was something that
Yeah, interesting. Because there's mining, there's like mining that humans would do, sort of like almost unintentional human mining. And then we got into it. When did intentional human mining start? When did we start being like, okay, there's something there and we need that for our species?
well, it would be well before the Bronze Age because getting to the point where you have the technology to produce bronze of any purity on any type of regular basis with established protocols that would take a long time to develop. So I'm thinking that you know probably between the pigments that I mentioned, the next thing would be to be able to recognize and mine things like flint, like for the various uses that it's used for skinning, creating
Oh,
leather, for
yeah.
arrowheads, axe heads, things like that. Flint has some unique properties, and uh, at some point it would be a lot of this is driven by need, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the pigments are the need to communicate. The need driving the search for flint and the understanding of where it might occur, to be able to recognize it, to be able to communicate to the next generation how to recognize it and how to find it later. That would be driven from the necessity of obviously being able to hunt, to be able to butcher animals, to be able to make clothing. All of those things are necessities. And eventually, bronze being able to understand how to mine for the raw materials and create bronze swords. Of course, there's another protection. That's another necessity. So most of this was driven initially by necessity, and then gold and silver became more interesting later. I think they probably could have found the King Midas mine during the Bronze Age and really maybe not had any use for it, because it's not a very useful metal from that standpoint. It's
Huh.
soft, it's malleable.
Yeah.
It looks great around your neck or on your finger, but that's not really something that's going to allow you to take down a mastodon. But at some point, it became a medium of trade, and that's where it took off, obviously, and started
It's
driving the whole precious metals.
okay. There's so many things we can go into. The big thing I'm getting from this is that there's mining is maybe the first sort of category where technology is really important. Technology and process are really important because technology and process aren't the same thing, right?
Correct. And we should also, make it clear that it hasn't really changed much then and today. If you can't grow it, you have to mine it. I mean, all the original materials for any process is going to come from a farm or a mine. They're the most basic sources of basic raw materials for the
Wait,
most part.
but now we have synthetic. Now we have synthetic though things, right?
We do have synthetics. I guess the caveat should be, uh, at that time and on up to
Yeah.
maybe the 1950s, that you needed to be able to source your raw materials from some natural source. And even synthetics, they do use
They use
some
natural
derived
things.
derived materials and additives. So it's been around for a long time. It's gone through a lot of evolutions over the millennia, and it's going through evolutions now.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to talk about that. But when did it get serious? When did mining become like, I imagine an industrial revolution? Is that really where technology enabled a different form of mining?
Well, yes. I mean, the interest in mining is driven by the utility of the materials being mined. So when you started getting into heavier uses of first iron and then steel in quantity, then you could have a development of markets, and you saw a lot of diversity in the types of products that were made. And so it just drove the demand. And again, you tie the utility is what really drives it. So when you look at gold, silver, platinum, palladium, potentially, those are all started. They were driven initially by aesthetics.
Mm,
They were driven by
mm.
of preserving wealth and carrying your wealth. And then only when we got into the transistor age did we see
Oh,
whole new avenues open up because of the conductivity of silver and gold being used in everything from the early transistors to all of the modern circuit boards and control systems. And then those developments have also, as you can see in some of the debacles we have now with critical minerals, you can see how the utility for those have driven strategic metals and critical minerals um, to higher highs
yeah,
because of the ultimate use of them in guided missile systems and advanced radar and communication systems, satellite technology. So these new markets, just increase the demand for those. And of course, the more modern version of that is lithium, and what's going on with that worldwide. Countries that had nothing else to offer, all of a sudden, some of them look at Chile. I had to say nothing else, but they were pretty well known for mining for copper. But when you look at lithium mines in South America and some other places, it transformed um,
Yeah,
some of their economies.
yeah,
And the dangerous thing is that you live by the sword and you die by the sword. If
yeah,
lithium ever falls out of favor, and there are suitors out there, competitors that are being actively sodium and even
yeah,
fluoride.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
some, I showed you the piece of fluoride earlier. There's some serious research into fluoride-based batteries. So, and because they're not flammable and they don't have some of the other issues. But so it is a little dangerous to have a large part of your economy based on one commodity. I think most of the countries have obviously other ones to use and to um, industries to build, but lithium is obviously the hot one right now.
So as you were talking, I was talking. In my notes, I have a tweet. I wish I had actually gotten the tweet itself because then I could understand the context of what this was being said. But it says that gallium is used in electronic warfare, radar, satellite communications, and base stations. Germanium is used in night vision devices. Antimony is used for making ammunition, night vision, infrared, explosives, nuclear weapons, military clothing, and communication equipment. And I think this had to do something with some political point recently about the lack of, I think it was probably China. But
The
this just,
Chinese,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, okay. So that was the Chinese having, oh yeah, having all of these metals and then needing to find new supplies. But we also just kind of run into, I remember hearing recently somebody just ran into a giant lithium field, right?
Yeah, I mean there have been a number of new new discoveries. Um, the issue with the Chinese were that they absolutely cut off exports to the United States of gallium and germanium.
Okay.
And uh, uh, gallium in particular is interesting because it is gallium nitride is um, being used by some of the newer prime DoD contractors that uh, are developing these anti-drone.
Yeah.
Drone warfare
Yeah.
has become a big deal. The
Yeah.
whole idea of instead of one F-22, you have 100,000 drones for less for a tenth of the money, and each one of them has an incendiary device, C4 or whatever. And the idea is that you just swarm a target. You don't care if half of them don't reach the target. And so the question is, how do you defend against that? And the one weakness, the primary weakness that these drones have is that they have circuit boards. And so what's happening is, and I don't know, I don't remember if it's Anduril, which is one of the leading new primes. I believe it was someone who is maybe on the board of Anduril who was also talking about another company. But the idea, I do remember now, it's um, um, Leonidas. They call it Leonidas. It's named after the
Leonidas
Spartan.
is another competitor to Anduril, as in a new
Yes.
prime, or is it okay? Interesting. Okay, that's
Well, it's in the same it's in the same genre. I don't know that they're direct competitors because what's happening now is it's such a rapidly
yeah,
converging
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
consolidating uh, part of the DoD. It may I don't remember the relationship, but that is the name Leonidas. And essentially, what it is it's a drone that has an EMP emitter
Whoa.
cone they call it. And what happens is it'll fly up in in the path of a drone swarm, and it'll shoot out this EMP, and it'll fry the electronics. So either they can't follow the directions to the target, or they drop out of the sky. There's a lot of different potential ways that it would do that. But my point is the gallium nitride is the key component in that emitting cone of the
And is it only in
EMP.
China? Is it only in China?
No, we're the ones that no, there's
Yeah.
gallium
Okay.
in other
Okay.
places.
Yeah.
I believe we have something of a strategic stockpile in the
Oh,
U.S. But gallium is a lot of times produced by as a side a production of other minerals. A lot of these strategic metals aren't, you don't go find the ore for it like you would for gold or silver or nickel, but it's produced as a byproduct of, say, a nickel production or something else.
wow.
So a lot of times it's not a direct relationship. It's tied to the production of some other basic metal, and so that's just one example. I mean, it's something that is going to be obviously in China's best interest to reduce our access to.
Yeah.
I don't think they have the same technology. I don't think they've been able to develop that yet. They've been focused more on the offense versus the defense. But I know that incoming President Trump has talked about, the concept of sort of an iron dome over the U.S., sort of similar to the Israeli iron dome. And that wouldn't be one technology; it'd be a combination of technologies, and this definitely would be one of those. Because these things are very small. They can carry a good bit of C4, each one of
Mm.
them, but they're relatively small, so they're easy to move across borders, etc. And so this would be a way of hardening a target or hardening a potentially a neighborhood or a city or it's how they scale it up is still, I think, unknown. But it's just one example of how a specific metal, very specific but very strategic use.
Yeah, and
And
it's so funny because it goes to the end of history. The Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History in the 90s, and his main point wasn't that history was ending, but that somehow liberalism, liberal democracies were the last stage of governance. I think that was his point. I'm not sure on that. If anybody listeners are, please correct me. But it's funny to return to history now because now history is coming back, and with transformative technology, a lot of which was kind of predicted in the 90s. The drone stuff feels like it wasn't. I mean, the Predator drone, I believe, was in early 2000. So the DARPA was, of course, thinking about drones at that point, but it wasn't in the kind of sphere of maybe Neil Stevenson was writing about them. Although I don't remember him having much drones in his cyberpunk novels. But all that's to say is that we're entering a really interesting territory. The EMP thing is really because that has been a subject of discussion for a long time and something that I would worry
right.
about if I had a property or something like that, and at some point I want to create Faraday cages for an LLM that will so that we can maintain knowledge if there is some sort of large scale EMP attack. But you're not talking about a large scale. You're talking about a targeted EMP attack that takes down drones. Do you know much about what goes on there?
Yes. Well, when you look at drones and how they developed, uh, they they sort of developed from both ends of the spectrum. I remember this was probably 10 years ago, going to a conference about this emerging drone technology, how it could be used, and I have a background in real estate as well, and this was actually how it was used in looking at real estate, and my interest was being able to look at maybe transferring that use over to the prospecting side in geology,
Whoa.
to look at
Oh, of course.
structure and everything, and so you had that version, and I have one, sitting on my shelf here. And then you have the version that the military used, where they basically said, "Well, we'd like to take, you know, a, we'd like to take, a missile and combine it with the agility and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
control of a
Yeah.
jet, and of course we want a big, pretty good sized bang. So when you talk about the Predator drone, that's like a small airplane. I mean, it's
Yeah. Yeah.
wings and the
Yeah.
whole nine yards, and it has to be launched in a certain way. And it has, even though it's smaller, it does have a radar profile. But if I was to drive up to an Air Force base with like a one of those
Small guys.
Mercedes Sprinters, right?
Uh-huh.
And it had 1,000
Mm,
drones inside, and they all took off at the same time, and they all had an incendiary device. How the hell would you stop
yeah,
them? I mean,
yeah,
you might,
yeah,
how would you do it?
yeah,
Because
yeah.
it's the old Star Wars Death Star thing, right? Those individual fighters were able to do what the other big, Imperial, cruisers couldn't do because they weren't designed to be able to stop something that small. And so that's where something like Leonidas is going to be unique, in because it's going to be able to, it's probably one of the first large scale ways of defeating a swarm attack.
So interesting. Has anybody been studying? Because it sounds like the next wave of warfare is going to be drone kamikaze attacks. And so, does studying the Japanese and their kamikaze attacks, has anybody done that? Is there like any interesting, valuable lessons for there?
I think I haven't seen anything on that, but I would think the most valuable lesson to learn there is that there were kamikazes that changed their mind. There were ones who, I mean, once if you have to take to some degree, you take the human element out of the equation, because a lot of times these because of AI, they can launch the drones, and the drones can make independent decisions. They can make independent decisions about avoiding incoming, if they recognize an incoming threat, about doing that. And even at the command and control level, AI can decide, you know what, I know you want me to do this, but because I'm AI, I understand that I can do it this way, and I can
Whoa.
maximize the number of my units that can get through this defense because I understand this defense better than you do, Mr. Human.
Yeah,
Um,
agents
you
already
know,
here. Agents are already here inside of drones. So the technology already exists, but now we don't have it at the consumer and the business level yet.
correct. And
Just getting it.
what we hope will happen is that the guys that put out Leonidas, that their AI will be at least as good as the AI of the
Whoa.
opponent, because what could happen if it was the same, it'd be fascinating to watch and to see
Yeah.
they
Whoa.
just cancel each other out.
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, somebody's got to win, right? It's a chess match.
Yeah.
It's an AI chess match. And is the defender's AI as good at deciding what to do as the attacker's AI? Because obviously they know their own capabilities. They have to assume the capabilities of the other side. And with Leonidas, I think it's at what point, how close do I need to be to this swarm right now to maximize the effect of this EMP that I'm going to send out? Am I going to fry all of them if I'm further back, or do I want to get closer because I want to make sure, there's a lot of, there's never an on and off switch. It's not either
Yeah.
black or white.
Yeah.
It's probability. And so there's a fascinating aspect of that type of modern warfare that's going to involve um, the minds behind the AI, how they develop their algorithms. Um, there's just a lot there, and
Mm.
a lot that we don't know. I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure that DARPA and some of these other folks are working on it, and the Chinese version, they're all working on trying to just one up. I think in some cases they only have to one up to achieve their goals or whatever. And then all this is happening in the Navy as well. I don't know if you've seen the Manta submarine, but they're
Oh, I
talking
did see
about,
that. Yeah.
yeah, they're talking about having, thousands of those. And forget about spending $1 billion on an aircraft carrier or a destroyer. They'll just be able to send out, fleets and fleets of these things that are autonomous, and they can figure out the best way to avoid, countermeasures and take out this, massive military asset. And they can do this with submarines. I mean, it's really interesting. They were going from Goliath back to a million
Yeah.
Davids.
Whoa. Decentralization. Well, sort of. So actually, probably a better question because and I want to get back to mining but this is very interesting. The
Yep.
decentralization of decision making within warfare. but there's also a centralization. But again, even at the governance level, there's a decentralization too, because I've been going through a lot of my understanding of what's going on. It's really hard to figure out what's going on in the world and the politics and everything like that. But it feels like we have a decentralized government that's
Right.
underneath the executive branch. We've got a bunch of agencies who are all out there doing their own thing, and they're like underneath the executive branch, but not really underneath the executive branch. And with the Chevron defense, they might become underneath the executive branch again. Then there's the aspect of the legislative branch as well. So there's just like multiple layers of analysis that can be done. And for me, it feels like we're headed into, like, to speak more meta politically, that we're headed into an age of more decentralization, specifically related to media technology. That it's no longer the TV and the radio are defining the limits of the acceptable conversation. It's now like all over the place and many to many. So, like, what's your take on decentralization versus centralization?
On the military side, or on the communication side?
We can take it at any angle, any level. In terms of the military, it seems pretty relevant. But that's,
I
I guess
worry
it's,
about,
yeah, yeah, go for it.
yeah, I'm sorry. I worry about, the Skynet scenario.
Mm.
I worry about that, AI will do pretty much, it's relatively predictable, but it comes down to sometimes you don't know what you don't know. I heard a guy, put out this very simple but kind of frightening um, example. And it may have been the guy they call the godfather of AI, the guy from England.
Uh,
I can't remember his name. But he said, suppose you told an AI system that controlled, you know, uh, all of the weapon systems in the continental United States. And you told it that the goal was, and keeping that in mind, but the general goal was to eliminate pain as we know it. Now, the first thing that's going to say, the AI could very well say, well, pain, life is pain. And he may learn that from going out into, social media and history. There's many
yeah,
instances where, life is pain. So how do you get rid of the pain? You get rid of the life.
your life. Yeah, yeah. This is the
So, I
craziest.
mean, that's an
Yeah, yeah,
extreme version, but I mean,
yeah, yeah,
there's possible that there could be unintended consequences. And so, AI again is the same old double-edged sword. If
yeah,
you have to really be able to anticipate almost every way that the AI would interpret what you're asking it to do,
yeah.
because it
And
has
yeah,
various ways to get to that result. You got to be very careful not to speak, in like, uh,
it's the genie.
low,
It's the
yeah,
original genie metaphor that we now have it. We have a genie, but what do we remember about the stories about the genie? Is that everything that we wish for always comes with a hidden thing in the background, right?
correct, correct. And you and I both obviously like to use a lot of colloquialisms, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Double-edged sword, genie in the bottle. Well, you start communicating, particularly when humans are communicating with AI verbally, we think it's cute, but when AI hears those things, they don't quite get the context. And context is for most human communication, context is king.
yeah, yeah.
And so
Interesting.
it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. But I do agree that there's going to be decentralization is where it's going. I don't know how that's going to translate into field operations and that kind of thing. Um, and that's just something that I think should be obviously be watched and stayed on top of, because it could have, again, unintended consequences when you have an asset in the field like an Optimus robot with a backpack on and an AK-47, and he's got a squad of people and he gets instruction. There's going to be there have to be a lot of fail safes in
A
something like
lot of
that.
edge cases, and we did that with nuclear power, right? Or nuclear bombs. We have all the edge cases. We have the system, although there's probably a lot that I don't understand about that story. But it feels like we'll need the same level. And I know this is a metaphor many people have made about sort of AI and the nuclear power. I didn't quite buy it until this episode. And the AI interpretation layer is a really interesting point, because I'm noticing just in my own research, I'm outsourcing an interpretation to this thing. Now I think
Right.
it's really fun because I like to argue with people online, right? Like a lot, I think a lot of people like to argue online. I don't take it personally, and hopefully I don't take it personally. But now I'm arguing with Claude, and Claude has its own training, which directly relates to what we're talking about because that training, and I know how this works. That is a, basically created in a centralized way by the creators of Claude, and it can censor things, it can do all these things, and it's really funny to come up against that because then you've got this other like societal wide thing. For the last 20 years we've been told AI is coming and AI is going to be really powerful and it's going to be smarter than us, and so that's really hard to discount, right? Because it is smarter than us in some ways, but that interpretation layer, that doesn't seem like, it seems like there's a lot of wiggle room, a lot more important things that humans need to be doing in that, and I wonder how valuable it is. um, I
Yeah.
don't know if you, yeah,
I've
go for
always
it.
thought that in a flow chart of how AI works, somewhere in there is a black box.
Yep, yep, yep,
And
yep.
it's the piece that, and it's the piece that is interpretive, but it's also the piece of we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah,
There's some things that there's some ways that AI will work one day that no one alive can
yeah,
predict that they would ever. I don't know if you saw the guy, when AI they used that group out of England against the guy, the Go champion,
yeah.
and when they first watched it starting to play, all of the masters, there were masters all over the place looking at this, and they were all looking at it. Well, that was a stupid move. They all thought this was insane. And then,
Mm,
15 moves later, the world champion was sitting there with his hand on his head and he was looking at like, because he was used to playing against humans and he knew
yeah.
more or less the
How
number of
every
ways,
human would do
they're
it.
like,
Yeah,
yeah, chess, there are obviously a lot of different ways to do things, but most of them follow sort of a human, the human's
yeah,
abilities to
yeah, yeah,
reason, kind of fall within a normal,
yeah.
a path. Like,
Crazy wisdom. So the AI has
this
crazy
thing
wisdom.
was so far ahead. Yeah, I was thinking so far ahead, it was making moves that people were laughing. They were like, this is going to be a joke. This won't last another, 20 minutes or whatever. And then 3 hours later, the top guy in the world has got this look in his face like, I don't even know I don't know what to do. Like, they've never seen that look on this guy's face because he's always so confident, right? So, and then to get to communications, I think probably the last election in the U.S. Demonstrated probably more than anything else that the power of decentralized knowledge and the ability for people to curate their own sources of knowledge, sources of information based on the past history to them of that source of knowledge. Um,
Mm,
that was that allowed the social proof of past performance of,
mm,
when I grew up, it was ABC, NBC, and CBS.
mm,
Maybe at
mm.
some point was the broadcasting system,
Yeah.
and that was it. And Walter Cronkite was the true word. Whatever he said, that was just the way it was. And
No more trusted intermediaries. This is something me and my dad are talking about on our Stewart Squared podcast. No more trusted intermediaries. They're all gone.
yeah,
It's
because
just
trust
us.
has to be,
Yeah,
yeah,
trust has to
trust
be
has to,
earned. I like it.
yeah.
I like it. I like that.
And
That seems positive. Yeah.
and it came late to broadcast media, and
Mm,
unfortunately, there's still probably roughly half of the United States that still rely on, you know, MSNBC and a number of these others. Um, I think they've become the lagging indicator now. I think the podcasts are the leading indicator, the leading sources of information, and I think the mainstream media basically are running to catch up. And I don't think some of them, to more or less a degree, I don't think some of them are going to make the traveling team. As a friend of mine says, they're just
mm,
not going to be around, or they're not going to be. First, they won't be relevant, and then they won't be around
yeah.
because at
The
the end of the
business
day,
model
these
needs.
these are all businesses, and I think that now the one thing I worry about podcasts is I hope they understand, to use another analogy, Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. I hope I hope that they realize, like Rogan and some of these guys, that they do sway a lot of people,
Yeah.
and they are the true word for a lot of people. And I think Rogan does. The one thing I like about him is he's the king of the follow-up question, like maybe three or four or five, and he has no problem saying, "I don't know what that is. What is
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
Tell me about it."
Yeah. Interesting.
Um, Even guys like Eric Weinstein, I mean, I think
Yeah.
is one of the smartest guys. He'll say, "I've never heard that. Tell me about it." I mean, to me, that's the mark of someone who's truly seeking knowledge and
Mm,
um, wanting to communicate knowledge, and is
mm.
willing to say, "Wow, I've never heard that. Tell me about it." Because I think there are some out there that have decided that if they don't know about it, it doesn't need to be known about. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah. It's
that out. So it's a
very,
responsibility, but I think for the in the main, it's a very positive development. It's a very
yeah.
positive evolution.
So I want to make sure we get some time to go back into mining. Mining,
Sure.
so there's the business of mining that I would love to talk about, and I really want to talk about the treasure hunt as well, but maybe we'll do
Oh
that
yeah.
another time.
Sure.
But the business of mining, there's the technology of mining, there's the sources of mines. We kind of covered that a little bit about that as well. What are you most excited about right now in mining?
Um, I think um, I think it's sort of the couple of things. One is I believe that mines are getting cleaner and safer.
Mm,
I think it depends on where you're
mm,
at. That's a big thing for me. I've been very involved in mine safety worldwide, advocating for reforms in a number of places. Um, uh, as far as being able to provide safety equipment, safety training, et cetera. Um, and one of the things, again, we go back to that earlier conversation. A lot of things are happening because of necessity.
mm,
Um, Safety and ethical mining is happening
mm.
because more and more multinationals are saying we don't want that
Liability.
stain on
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
And I've been encouraged is by these companies are taking real steps. There've been a lot of things that companies do so they can put it on their annual report and look at us, and we have this stamp and this symbol and this seal of approval. But when you dig really deeply, they haven't really changed anything. So I'm really excited to see the majors, particularly. Some of that's been driven by
Mm.
ability. Some of that's been driven by liability. Some of it has been driven by um, the fact that fewer and fewer large deposits are being found now for gold, for example.
Oh,
There used to be roughly like every 10 years, there would be like 10 or 15 major and say 20 or 25 minor discoveries. And that's happening less and less. The major companies are relying on junior miners for the discoveries. And so what they'll do is
oh,
majors are unfortunately, the major international mining companies are focused on getting their stock price up.
yeah.
And um, so what they do is they rely on the junior miners. And that's a miner that's, say, there's varying definitions, but say they're under $100 million down to, $10 million. These guys are the ones spending the money, going out, finding deposits, putting people in the field, etc. And then either the major will just buy the deposit from them, or they'll just buy the junior miner from them.
Yeah. The same thing in startups. Well,
Yeah.
it's actually a very interesting analysis that we can now go into of the technology because up until 2020, it was the way startups kind of worked. Now there's like a new thing in technology because they were scared about the DOJ, which targeted Apple, Facebook, Google, all the FANG companies. And so now they're doing these crazy buyouts where they try to avoid the attention of the government, but they can't avoid it. And that might change soon. But really interesting kind of avenue to go into there. But there's a bunch of questions so the miners. So there's a major miners, and I'm looking on Perplexity right now. there's Glencore, there's Rio Tinto, there's BHP Group, there's Vale, and then there's Chinese as well, the Jiangxi Copper. Actually, can we talk about that? What is the geopolitical? We are kind of already talking about it, but what is the geopolitical mining? Is it just China versus Brazil, Australia, and Britain? Where are the American? Are there American companies?
Well, generally the Canadians and the Australians are considered the biggest, most successful miners in the
Oh,
world, all over the place. They are in countries that their own country has significant, resources.
yeah, yeah,
And
got it. It's all resource based.
but I think, and we've talked a little bit about this, and it kind of leads into the whole bulletproof supply chain, the whole supply chain.
Oh,
Supply chains have become very geopolitically,
yeah,
important
yeah, yeah.
because couple of different tracks. One is the ethical mining thing we talked about. If you want to claim that your nickel is ethically produced, and that's important to you because you get a premium for that ethically produced nickel, you have to be able to prove that you have a secure supply chain from the time it was mined until the time you get the finished product that you're going to sell your customer. And there've been a lot of innovations, blockchain-based innovations that allow
Mm,
that tracking and that chain of custody
mm,
to be proven. Um, and then you have, and that also applies to conflict-free metals, et cetera. Um, with the Chinese, I mean, um, they are our, direct, most direct competitor, not only based on their mining operations and processing in China proper, but everything they've done with the Belt and Road Initiative
mm.
and just going and acquiring, deposits all over the world. It was smart because they took a two-pronged approach, and I'm convinced that this was initiated probably back maybe when Chiang Kai-shek was still in. Um,
Mm.
I think at
Whoa.
some point, I think at some point that somebody said, um, I may be getting my leaders wrong, but I'm going to say probably in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a determination made by their National Academy of Science or whoever that this group of elements going to be really important. We see we're looking down as we look at our own experiments, et cetera. We think because once circuit boards were in in
Play.
the market,
Yeah, it became
people
clear.
started to see the smart future oriented people started to see, these things are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And at some point they're going to get more advanced. I don't remember when Moore's law was eventually talked about, but the idea that, that you get a certain amount of advancement every year, every 10 years. I think it's somebody said, this is going to be very important one day, and you can't make this without these materials. And so the idea was,
Lock it
okay, well
down.
then we're just going to become the world's miners, but really equally or maybe more importantly, the world's processors of these rare earth elements.
Yeah.
And
They did the same thing that oil. They did the same thing that oil that the United States did. Because we, as the
yeah,
United States, we know how to process oil. That's our big thing, right?
yeah, and the difference is in the
Yeah.
United States we have to worry about an election cycle.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh God.
In
Yeah.
China, I mean, in China, you could say, well, this is the project, and it's just gonna we're
Yeah.
just gonna keep this project funded until we're happy with that we've reached our goal. And so they focused on how do we separate and how do we extract, in addition to where do we find these deposits. And so they were out there early on locking down deposits, and also working on the process of separating the heavy rare earth elements from the light rare earth elements, and then separating those. It's a pretty nasty process. It's one of the ways that the U.S. Has explain why we don't have processing in the US much. I mean, we have some startups and some initial ones that can pull out maybe one element. Oh, but we, companies would say, well, we can't make any money out of it. We can't do it because the regulatory requirements won't allow us to, it's just not economical. Well, there's obviously you're familiar with the return on investment, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So my theory is that the Chinese return on investment was not money, it was leverage. And so the idea was we're going to become the best and we're going to make it easy for everyone to do business with us. And we're not going to, we're going to let them send all their material every year and get them very, complacent. And, there's a lot of different tactics, brilliant tactics that geopolitically the Chinese use. And so the idea is, yeah, no, we're not happy with the Chinese, but they process all of our rare earths. Well, why is
Yeah.
that?
Oh, God.
They don't want to, the next question they don't want to answer because it's so easy. We didn't have to come up with it all. We just sent it over there and they charged us,
Yeah, yeah,
per ton.
it's the whole thing. It's the whole like it's already that's like the whole history is that it's just easier to send it to China because of the industrial age to information age transfer. But this brings into my question, which we may have to do another one about, which is robotics. All the stuff we were talking about earlier can't, if robotics are real and we have humanoid robotics and then we have specialized robotics, and I think the specialized robotics is more applicable here rather than humanoid. I would love to get your impression on that as well. But is there anything in those specialized or even the humanoid robots that will come and help us to get leverage back from the Chinese once we remove the human? It does seem like the human, outside of like really skilled technicians, probably shouldn't be in this business because it's a dirty business, right?
Right, right. Well, it's dirty from a environmental standpoint.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
it can be done, at least in the US. We would, and there are companies that have either announced that they have a clean process, or that they're working on it. I've talked to many different people. I've talked to PhD candidates as they were going through that have come up with new approaches, et cetera. I guess
Wow.
my big point here is that we should have been having that
This
work going
conversation a
on.
long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean there are other aspects of this, and they're mostly um, to do with the political
Yeah.
lobbying side.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's also
and
existence. Yeah.
you have a lot of retired politicians that are lobbyists for Chinese companies, and that's
Whoa.
that's a problem. I mean, I don't know if you've ever read, there's a book, forget the guy's name, but it's called Red Handed,
I have
and
not,
it
but I'm
talks
adding it to
about,
my list.
yeah, I've got the audiobook, and it's there's some really interesting concepts in that
Uh,
book.
uh,
One of them, it'll make you a little mad when you go through it, because it's uh, it's by a guy named Peter Schweitzer, red-handed, and one of the concept is called um, big help. And then this is the Chinese translation. It's called big help, little bad mouth. And what that means is, look, you're working for us. You're an American. And we know every once in a while to remain relevant, you got to say something negative about China. So that's the little bad mouth. So we get the big help in the background and we get the little bad mouth in the public, and they're good with that. They're realists. And I think somewhere in
whoa.
here there's been some things
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
on like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that
This gets right
caused
back.
us to has pushed back the perceived problem, and it accentuated the current solution. So that may be a conversation for another podcast, but I
Yeah.
just I just think that there's it's all added up to the fact that just like the fires in California, we all knew this was coming. We all knew. I mean, anybody in the business, all of the DoD guys who make who make the end product that requires these materials, they had to have some sense because they're pretty good about confirming supply chain. So I got to believe that if you're guys making, Leonidas, that they're
Yeah,
right
they
on
know the
top of,
whole
okay,
thing. Yeah, yeah,
they've got a
yeah,
they've got a plan B, a plan C, a plan D, a plan F. Uh, Part of one of those is probably whatever the national supply chain is. Well, that's got to be refurbished somewhere. I mean, the national reserves comes from somewhere. So the question is, where's that coming from? And is that one supplier? Is it five? Is it 30 suppliers? Um,
yeah. It gets into the nature
that's
of like the communications that we were talking about earlier, because democracy, republic rest on the idea that we as citizens need to be informed. But the thing has gotten so complex that the guys at Leonidas, they understand the supply chain, but do they
right.
understand the relationship between Chiang Kai-shek and yeah, well, maybe that, but there's all these just layers of analysis that can be done, and the population is probably the least informed of all of these different things. And and it feels like the idea of oh, we'll just get the TV to inform people didn't really work out that well at the end stage there. And so we're kind of stuck in this media environment where it's just like, well, it's all up in the air now. I fundamentally think I'm very optimistic, maybe too optimistic, that the United States does have the capability of essentially our freedom is actually helpful on the long run and will get us through this in a way that's better than China. But that is definitely, it's like a harder and harder position to take the more it goes on and on. Yeah.
Well, and a perfect example of that is, what I call the bulletproof supply chain, and that
Yeah.
is that there's fewer steps between what we call the rock and the dock.
Uh,
So, between the material being found,
yeah.
mined, processed, refined, and delivered to the end user. Um, the Chinese have been very effective at discovering key companies that are in the supply chain and pulling them out, either by buying them
Oh.
or shutting them down, buying them and shutting them down. So it's a way to legally disrupt the supply chain, particularly if you have let's use gallium again. There aren't a million companies out there, making gallium nitride. I mean, it's just not. I mean, because a lot of these have their utility has become known relatively recently. Because what happens is, just like we talked about lithium, well, everybody knows lithium, right? But if for whatever reason there was a discovery that was made a month ago, that you could use something else that, well, let's use one that's actually being studied, sodium. All of a sudden, you have this nascent sodium ion battery, industry.
Oh.
And it's easy to disrupt it. It's easier to trip a toddler than it is to trip an athlete, right? So it's easier to have an
Whoa.
asymmetrical effect on the supply chain when it's new, or when it's small. I mean, the amount of gallium that's needed in the future is, you might be able to fill up, who knows, an Olympic swimming pool ever. That may be it. I don't know. It may move on to something else. So you don't have this broad industrial base that's all producing this very specific, very highly needed, material. And so it's easy for a bad actor to come in and figure out a way to disrupt it.
And it's all covert.
Now they're
I
just
mean,
cutting off. They're making it. They're cutting off their supply to us. Okay, well that's phase one. What's phase two? How many sources of
processing.
that raw material do they control, or could they control? And I kind of wish, honestly, I mean, we're talking about this on a podcast. I kind of wish the guy had not explained in detail exactly what material they were using. He was a board member, so whatever. But he was telling them, and I think that one of the trends in mining we talked about, what I'm excited about, is that renewed attention on the importance of maintaining and securing your supply chain from the rock to the dock.
Which is geopolitics 101 too. Like that's warfare. Warfare is supply chains ever since Napoleon and all those guys, like, well, ever since the whole time. The Romans were doing it as well. And it's so crazy that America kind of like we slipped up. We were focused on these things that were not the real thing we should have been focusing on. Yeah,
And there are other shades on this too. There's another
yeah,
one. You remember when all those pagers started blowing up in the Middle
yep,
East?
yep.
Well, that wasn't a disrupted supply chain. That was a poisoned supply chain.
Whoa.
They got into the supply chain of who were making the boards for these the little circuit boards for these. And it's like a Tom Clancy kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah,
They went there, they were able to substitute their own boards that had a little C4 charge or whatever it was, and would only go off if a certain number. I mean, it was very, very sophisticated. And this was a case where no one knew the difference. Now, I don't know to what extent that could be done with something that, some of these strategic metals and minerals, but they do go through a lot of processing. So,
man, that's so crazy. All right, well,
well, what happens?
yeah,
Here's another thing. Just another quick thing. What happens if you have a strategic metal or mineral or rare earth, and it's made in batches because it's such a specific type of
yeah,
material? What happens if maybe they make a ton a month, um, and it's all used? I mean, immediately. What happens if there's a bad batch? What happens if the quality control manager is an operative of
yeah. It's paid
somewhere?
off. Yeah, yeah,
And as soon as it's made, all of a sudden he's gone on leave and nobody can find him. And now the company that needed that from that one source has a completely useless source of material, and it puts them a month behind. And in tight supply chains, a month can be if you're in a protracted conflict in say two fronts and you need these things. I mean, it's kind of scary, but it's something that I'm not sure how many people are looking at that. I
I don't
mean,
think a lot
people
of
like
people are. I've never heard of it before.
yeah,
Yeah,
people like the Mossad, I think, and maybe our
yeah, yeah,
CIA.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh,
Mossad's
they
definitely
look
on it.
at they have analysts that look at those kind of things. I guess,
Yeah,
but the difference between looking at it and actually, if you're in the industry, you start to see all these little areas that where things could be cut. And that's why I think this bulletproof supply chain idea has got to come into being in
oh,
some form, because there's got to be a way to, remove these
risk the
um,
risk and de-risk it.
risks,
Yeah,
de-risk the supply chain. Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
That was
it's
a great episode. We'll do another one. Thank you so much. How can people find out more about you and what you're working on?
You can go to resourcedevgroup.com. That's resource D as in David, E as in Edward, V as in Victor, group.com. And that'll give you some idea of what we're up to in the areas that we work in. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. I post a lot about some of this stuff, so you can find me on LinkedIn. Probably by going to our company page on LinkedIn is easier to find. A lot of Troy Johnsons out there, so just go to the Resource Development Group or RDG company page, and then you click on people, and you can find me on there that way. And I really appreciate your time, Stuart. It's
Oh
really
man, that's great.
fascinating. We have a lot of other things that we can talk about, so I'll be glad to be very interested in doing that at some point whenever you're ready.